Good morning and welcome. This is 10 Years Hence. My name is Jim O'Rourke. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Management and director of the Fanning Center for Business Communication. I'll be your instructor and host for this lecture series. We've arranged a series of 7 lectures for you that I think you will find both interesting and exciting. Our aim is to engage in some structured speculation about the future, specifically the decade just ahead and the world we're likely to inhabit 10 years from now. While I have an intellectual interest in what happens 100 years from now, it's only a detached intellectual interest. My hope is actually 10 years from now, we'll all be here and we'll have to deal with the issues that are certain to arise along with those things which are utterly unexpected. We'll do all of this from a number of perspectives, but all of it will be focused on our central theme of the future. Our speakers come to us from many parts of the nation and all walks of life. Robert Schleckser comes to us from the Exxon Mobil Corporation in Dallas, Texas. Lloyd Adams is Chief Operating Officer for America's Regulated Industries at SAP. Lieutenant General Michelle Johnson is Superintendent of the United States Air Force Academy. John Gordon is Vice President of Marketing and Strategy for IBM's Watson Solutions Division. Dr. Shibli Talami is the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. Michael Merck is Director of Corporate Communication at Steelcase Incorporated, and John Friedman is Global Government Affairs Leader for GE's Power and Water Division. We'll gather here on 7 separate Friday mornings during the spring semester, beginning promptly at 10:40 a.m. Each morning, concluding at noon. In order to make this a productive, useful experience for all, I have just a few requests of you. First, please plan to arrive here on scheduled lecture dates before 10:40 a.m. We'll begin promptly at 10:40, and I'd like you to be in your seat ready to listen. Second, if you've not already done so, please pick up a copy of the syllabus and make note of the dates on which we will gather here. If you're enrolled in the course, I've mailed you a PDF version of that document, which you'll also find on the Mendoza website. Third, please give our guest lecturers your full attention and courtesy. This means, of course, my preference for you to be fully awake and engaged in the process. No trips outside the lecture hall, barring a genuine emergency of some sort. Fourth, please turn off your cell phones, iPods, iPads, laptops, and other electronic gizmos. I am serious. Please close your laptops. See to it that nothing electronic interferes with our ability to learn from our time together this morning. Fifth, if you are enrolled in this course for credit, you'll be required to attend all lectures. I will handle exceptions to this rule personally and will not allow unexcused absences. Even if the absence is justified, excused, and documented, and there are some folks missing this morning, the hockey team and some folks off at a case competition, you will need to make up the work. That means viewing and summarizing the lecture you've seen on digital video or attending another lecture on campus. See me for details. If you're enrolled in this course for credit, you'll receive a color-coded stamped attendance card at the beginning of each lecture. Please print your name on that card along with the last 4 digits of your student number. At the conclusion of each lecture, we will place receptacles for those cards at the entrances on both first and second floor. Please deposit your card as you leave. If you don't deposit your attendance card, you will be noted as absent. Finally, I'm told the college is hosting a large luncheon gathering in the atrium today at 12 noon, so we'll ask that you depart either by way of the second floor doors or the first floor exterior exits. The collection bins for your cards will be down here. And so we'll keep you out of the luncheon, which I think they'll appreciate. Our speaker will conclude his remarks today and offer an opportunity for you to participate by asking questions. We'll have wireless microphones available, and we ask that you to wait for the attendant to pass one to you so that we can capture your question on digital video and so that everyone can hear it. Let's begin with our first session. Mr. Robert N. Schleckser is Vice President and Treasurer for Exxon Mobil Corporation. Mr. Schleckser was born in East Orange, New Jersey, and received his Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from the University of Notre Dame in 1978. He joined Exxon Research and Engineering Company in 1978 as a process engineer. In his career of 35 years, Mr. Schleckser has had a variety of management positions in engineering, planning, refining, supply and logistics, corporate finance, shipping, banking and cash management, and investor relations. He spent 2 years overseas working as an engineer at the Fawley Refinery in the United Kingdom. He moved from his position as controller of global fuels marketing to become the downstream treasurer of ExxonMobil in Fairfax, Virginia in 2005. He returned as assistant treasurer in 2009 to the corporation, became vice president and treasurer in 2011. Mr. Schleckser and his wife Kay have 2 children, Catherine, a Yale graduate, Harvard Law, 14, and his son Christopher, who's with us this morning. They reside in Dallas, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Robert Schleckser.
Thank you very much. Everybody hear me all right? Okay. I was quite happy when they offered me the opportunity to do the lecture series. One, it's good to get out and see Chris and his buddies. I did ask, the first question I asked was, would the Friday before the Blue Gold game be available? They said, no, that one was taken. January 31st is available. So bring back some memories. I will be cheating a little bit. This is called the 10 Years Hence lecture series. I'm going to show you projections around energy future that go out to the year 2040. Why do we do that? Because the investments we make as an energy company will have a life cycle that goes, frankly, well beyond the year 2040, and we need to have a sense of energy trends that extend well beyond the 10-year environment in order to feel comfortable putting that investment in place. This is not going to be a mystery novel, so I'm going to kind of dispel any notion up front that we would project in the year 2040 that oil and gas will still have a very important role in filling energy needs for the global economy out in that year. And the first reaction might be, isn't that kind of self-serving for an oil and gas company to draw a picture of the world that shows that what we do will have demand that far out into the future? And let me try to dispel that with 2 comments. One is, if I was somebody from the International Energy Agency, independent perspective coming up here, I would show a future of the world that's going to look pretty close to what we're going to show you today. In other words, we differ a little bit in some trends or some expectations, but it's pretty much the same story you would hear for any independent view of the future. And the other comment I'd make is there's no purpose for us to be self-serving in terms of how we do this outlook. Again, our job is to put investor capital to work in a way that it's going to earn a fair return for our shareholders, and we don't want to put that shareholder money at risk without the prospect of earning a good return over time. From the point in time that we begin negotiating access to an opportunity for energy with a host government, conclude those negotiations with some kind of an agreement, do the exploration, the seismic work and the exploration to confirm that what we thought was a good geological prospect, in fact, looks to be commercially attractive, to then develop that to the point where we have a production facility and then produce, the lifespan of that process can be 40 to 50 years. Or in another context, 10 to 12 U.S. presidential administrations that this capital investment has to live through. So there's no purpose for us to create a fictitious view of the future before we put that investor capital to work. So that's why we do the energy outlook. Let me also say, by the way, and this may or may not work, I would love for you guys to ask questions whenever they occur to you. You don't have to wait till the end. If it's something on a chart that spikes a question, I'd be just as happy this is a little more of a dialogue, because both you and I will get a lot more bored if it's just me talking for the next hour. So please, anything that comes to mind, I'd be happy to answer. Let's talk a little bit about how we do what we do. And this is an outlook that we do every year in the front end of our strategic plan. It projects well beyond. Our strategic plan culminates in a business plan for the next 1 to 2 years. But because that's going to involve investment decisions that go out much further, we update this long-term view of the future every year. All right, there we go. This is a very bottom-up exercise. We start looking at energy demand and supply for 100 countries around the world. 15 different demand sectors, whether it's industrial, agricultural, lubricant, commercial. And within each of those sectors, we're going to look at 20 different fuel types that are needed to supply the energy for those sectors. We overlay on top of that technology advancement and policy initiatives. We'll come back to policy in just a second, because that has a lot of influence over the expectations and the costs associated with relative sources of fuel to fund economic growth in the future. And then last thing we want to look at are trade flows, where energy is sourced versus where energy demand is, and how will those trades be accommodated. So let's come back just to a second to policy. And what I've shown here is our expectation of carbon policy, which we overlay on our energy projections out into the future. And what you'll see is in the red or developed world, we are expecting that there will be an evolving cost of carbon that are laid in by various mechanisms, which will influence fuel choice. And the red areas there is where that cost of carbon will be imposed at more than $40 a ton. Kind of the semi-developed world in yellow where it's 20 to 40, and then the green where we really don't expect policy initiatives to affect their fuel choices, at least for the foreseeable future. Our view of these choices is, I guess I'd express it in a way, and then take this as kind of a political statement from Exxon Mobil, is we believe in the long term allowing technological innovation to flourish in a free trade environment, and thereby letting market forces dictate solutions, will lead us to a much better place than government-imposed mandates or politically chosen winners and losers on energy sources. So, in other words, we would translate in the U.S., what if we want to impose a cost of carbon, make it transparent. We would say a revenue-neutral carbon tax might be the most transparent, clean way of doing that, to say that maybe there is a social cost of carbon as it affects climate change, et cetera, but then let the market forces dictate how best to address fuel choices within that social cost of carbon, as opposed to renewable fuel subsidies, et cetera, that try to create winners and losers by mandate. I'll get back down off my soapbox now, and we'll talk a little bit more about demand. We're going to take this discussion. First, we're going to focus on demand for energy. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about supply. And at the very end, I want to switch a little bit to the discussion around technological innovation as it relates to the United States. All right, let's start. When we look at the demand for energy, frankly, you have to start with population and economic growth. Energy is one of the main engines to fuel economic growth, so you have to say, well, what are the projections? In the world today, there's about 7 billion people. Our projections say, based on current trends, that by the year 2040, there will be about 9 billion people in the world. Meaning if you think bathroom lines are long now, they'll be much longer in the year 2040. Most of that growth is going to be in the non-OECD world. It's going to be in places like China and India and other places. The OECD world, the developed world, we expect populations will remain relatively flat. If you translate that to growth in economic output, we expect economic output to grow and more than double in this time frame, grow at about 3% globally. And that's a mix of about 2% of annual growth in the developed world and about 4% on average in the developing world. Not surprising that today the developing world continues to grow at a much faster pace, and that's why most of that growth occurs outside the developed or OECD world. Then when we talk about global economic growth around the world, to put that in more tangible terms, first off we say, well, how well do we believe, how can we project 30 years from now how sustainable economic growth would be? I found this chart to be really interesting. If you plot economic growth in the U.S. on a log scale back to the year 1850, as much as we've had spikes, depressions, et cetera, you could almost put a ruler on that line that says we've averaged about 3.5% annualized growth in the U.S. economy for the last 150 to 200 years, which is really a sign of the resiliency of economic innovation, demand growth, population growth over a long period of time. This doesn't mean that our projections for the year 2040 will be precise, but it means we can be comfortable that they're realistic, that it doesn't take us into a realm that we just think is unrealistic for economic growth. To put economic growth in the non-OECD countries in more tangible terms, what we're really talking about are people's living standards improving as a lot of the developed world, whether it's Africa or India, people are still today cooking with wood, with charcoal, with other forms of biomass, converting that to modern types of fuel. We're looking at agricultural work being converted from animal-based to more efficient mechanized forms of agriculture. And we're looking at non-electrical means of lighting and fuel converting to more modern forms. And when you look at the 7 billion people in the world today, you might be surprised to learn about 20% of those 7 billion people today consume zero electricity. They have no access to electricity. One of the forms of growth in demand of energy will be a trend in urbanization of those populations of the world outside the U.S. And if you look at the next two charts, what this shows is today the level of global urbanization. The dark areas there are where more than 75% of the people in those countries live in urban centers. And the yellow dots are cities or urban centers with more than 10 million people. And there's about 25 of those today. The urbanization trend in countries like China, et cetera, will change that over the next 30 years to the point where there is a lot more urbanization and about 31 new urban centers, mostly in non-OECD countries, with more than 10 million people. Why is that important? If you look at a country like China today, the energy consumption per capita for somebody living in a city is about 3 times as high as it is for somebody living in a rural environment. So this is an important trend for us to consider what the aggregate energy demand change is going to be over that time period. Okay, so we've talked about global progress drives demand. So how much energy do we think that will require? And this next chart shows our projection of total energy demand over those 30 years. And again, in the blue, in the OECD world, we expect very little growth. Essentially, it's saying that efficiency accommodates economic growth. So we can grow the economy, but not really change the amount of energy we use. And a lot of growth in the non-OECD or the developing world, where the energy contribution to economic growth is less efficient. You'll see that the growth rate in energy is actually quite a bit less than the growth rate in economic output. And in fact, if you superimpose on that energy efficiency, it would say that if the energy output mirrored economic growth, if we became no more efficient in how we use energy, we would need almost twice as much energy out in the year 2040 as we would project we actually need. And in fact, the 500, and by the way, if people are kind of thrown off by the term quadrillion BTUs, think of in the world today, we use about 90 million barrels a day of oil. And 90 million barrels a day of oil is about 175 quadrillion BTUs, so just to try to put it on a slightly different reference scale. But essentially, we will have to save by energy efficiency as much energy as the world uses today in total in order to support economic growth to the tune that we're projecting and keep energy demand to growing only by 35%. Another way of saying that is the largest source of new energy will be saving energy that we use today. Otherwise, the demand would be quite a bit higher. So it requires that level of efficiency in order to support economic growth. Go to the next. Okay, where is the energy? Where is the demand? And we've projected energy demand in 4 different sectors: electricity, industrial, which is both the consumption of raw materials, energy raw materials to make chemicals or other heavy industrial, as well as the energy needs to create steel, concrete, et cetera. Transportation, both in terms of personal transportation as well as commercial movement of goods and services. And then lastly, in residential and commercial. And in those last 3 categories, we've stripped the electricity component out of them, and that's sitting over in the electrical generation bucket. Electricity will grow about 90% in this time frame. The other is slightly less when you exclude the electricity component from them. All right, there we go. If you superimpose so you shift the piece of electricity that relates to those other sectors over, you'll see that industrial and residential commercial demand will also grow. And we'll talk about each of these a little bit more. with a good chunk of that being electricity. And the other thing you may notice is the size of the red bars that sit on top of industrial and commercial don't look as tall as the total amount of electricity we're generating. And the reason for that is the inefficiency in generating electricity and transmitting it. So we have to generate almost twice as much energy equivalent of electricity, or the amount of fuel we have to put into electricity generation ends up being almost twice as much as the final delivery of electricity to industrial or residential and commercial needs. That's because, again, the creation of electricity by burning gas or hydro or whatever is low enough, and then the transmission losses are low enough that you lose more than 50% of the fuel that you actually put in the front end of the process. All right, we'll talk a little bit about, yeah, a question, yeah.
Can you go back one?
I think I can, yeah.
Thanks. Is the electricity generation that you're talking about there only the demand that Exxon Mobil sees?
This is global. The whole world. The question was, is this only the demand that we have? No, this is our global estimate of electricity demand for the world.
So no matter what source the electricity?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we'll come back and show you what the source of that power is. We'll talk a bit about. We're going to take each of these apart for a little bit. Any other questions? Okay, residential and commercial. If you look at the growth by sector, both the residential and commercial functions, and again, this is driven heavily by urbanization in the non-OECD world. And if you look at where by region that growth is occurring, again, the developed world really isn't chewing up any more energy. It's the rest of the world, China, Africa, India, where the growth is occurring. Here we go. And if you look at it by fuel, for residential and commercial purposes, you'll see that today there's a lot of biomass. Biomass is a very friendly way of saying wood, coal, and things like dried cow dung, but biomass is a better way of saying it. Will be replaced by things like electricity and natural gas, which are both cleaner burning, more modern fuel types. So they will encroach and kind of crowd out the more primitive types of fuel like biomass and supply that residential and commercial growth. And this is, again, this is really about living standards. And you know, one of the challenges when we talk about energy policies is today the developed world has built their economies on the back largely of affordable energy. And as we look in the future, as much as carbon footprint management is extremely important, it's very difficult, or when we make those decisions, we have to build into the equation the ability of the developing world to improve their standards of living and still have affordable energy sources as a means to do that. And so to us, it's all about policy balancing. Transportation. The transportation sector is still dominated to a large extent by liquid fuels. And we'll show you some penetration, we'll show you some other stats. The reason liquid fuels dominate, about 95% of transportation today is supported by liquid fuels. And it's a function of energy density, transportability, and infrastructure. We've already seen, and look, there's evolution of a lot of technology in cars, et cetera, but in today's world, the energy density in a liquid fuel to move a car a far enough distance between fueling to be efficient and effective still makes liquid fuels dominate. So about 95%. And if you want a fun fact about liquid fuels, 1 gallon of gasoline will power a cell phone for 10 years. I wouldn't suggest trying that, but that's about the energy density of a single gallon of gasoline. So when we look at energy efficient or transportation, and what this first chart says is let's look at the evolution of the car fleet, light-duty vehicles. So these are cars, pickup trucks, vans, et cetera. Up to this point in time, it's been primarily conventional diesel, conventional gasoline, and there's just a small encroachment of hybrid and other types of vehicles today. Today in the U.S., 3% of new vehicles sold are hybrids. We do see an increasing role for hybrids in creating energy efficiency or vehicle efficiency, miles per gallon, over the next 30, 40 years to the point where, and when we're talking about hybrid here, it's in that blue growing segment, it's not a plug-in vehicle. It's a vehicle with both a conventional gasoline engine and a parallel electrical motor. which is conserving braking energy, et cetera, translating that to electrical power and then restoring that and increasing the vehicle efficiency. Plug-ins still have a cost challenge. Natural gas and other sources for small cars still have a cost challenge as well as a distance and energy density challenge. But we do see a very large penetration of hybrid conventional gasoline and hybrid cars. We look at the vehicle fleet average. Oh, by the way, you also see that the total number of vehicles projected in the world about doubles over this time period, from about 1 billion vehicles in the world to about 2 billion. Today, there are about 300 plus or minus million vehicles in North America. There's about 58 million in China. If you think of the relative populations of those two locations, vehicle density in the U.S. and North America is about 20 to 30 times per capita vehicle density in places like China. We expect by the year 2040, the number of vehicles in China will be almost the same as the number of vehicles in North America. So this growth in vehicles, again, occurs primarily outside the current developed world. If you look at vehicle efficiency, we expect almost a doubling of vehicle efficiency from the mid-20s today up to the mid-40s by the year 2040. And if anybody does the math here, if you double the vehicles and you double the efficiency, what it's going to say is that energy demand for cars and other light vehicles, it will be essentially flat over the next 30 years. And now there is a wide range. Today, Europe vehicles are much more efficient than vehicles in the U.S. because of our preference for SUVs, pickup trucks, et cetera, much more than in Europe. We expect both fleets will grow, but there will remain a pretty wide variety of vehicle efficiency by each of those locations. When we look at the broader aspects of transportation demand, you see in the bottom there the light-duty vehicles. Again, that's the cars and vans and pickup trucks. And as I said, we show even though the fleet was doubling, demand for energy over the next 30 years for that light-duty fleet is fairly flat. All of the growth is going to occur in heavy-duty vehicles, rail, aviation, et cetera, which is the movement of goods and services. As economies grow, it creates that demand as opposed to the movement of people. So a large increase in transportation demand in total, but it's all in the movement of goods and services. And we look at where that is today. This is the energy demand in 2010 for transportation. And then what we show is by the year 2040, there's growth everywhere, but it's largely dictated by Asia Pacific. And again, it's movement of goods, it's rail, it's commercial movement of products and services. All right, we'll move to industrial sector. And again, this is consumption of energy for the purpose of manufacturing goods, or actually the use of fuels for things like chemical production where it's actually consumed in the making of the final product. There will again be significant growth, about a 30% growth. All of that again outside the industrialized world today. And in fact, most of it outside areas like China as well. It's interesting, if you look at the increased projection for someone like China over this time period, it's somewhere in the range of about a 25% increase. And some of that is driven by the expectation of China beginning to transition from a manufacturing, infrastructure-driven economy to the beginnings of a service-oriented economy, more like what we have in the developed world. Whereas the rapid growth will be in places like India and Africa, where growth rates will be in excess of 100% in terms of industrial demand growth. What I've shown in the other bar, the two circles you see there, is in the inner circle will be the fuel type in the year 2010, and the outer circle is the change in those fuel types by the year 2040. And what we expect is today, coal is a very large piece of the puzzle for industrial demand, and that will shrink and be supplanted by either electrical sources of energy or gas. And again, a lot of that is carbon policy driven, that things will begin to edge coal out in terms of a primary fuel in the industrial sector. All right, then last week we can talk about energy generation and electricity generation. Again, we expect total electricity generation to jump by 90% over this time period. And again, realize that today 20% of the world consumes none of it. When we look at electricity use by region, the amount of electricity each of us use in North America is a multiple of what the rest of the world uses, and in fact, it's about 5 to 1. The rest of the world uses about 20% per capita of the electricity we use here in North America. Europe would be next, Asia Pacific, and you see the rest of the world shrinks quite a bit. If you project that out to the year 2040, there's quite a bit more energy, electricity consumption in the emerging parts of the world, but even by the year 2040, the per capita use of electricity by folks outside North America is still only about a third of what we project people in North America to be using. The total goes up by 90%. Most of the growth is outside the U.S. or North America, but still we consume by far the most per capita. Now look at economic choices for how we generate, more to the question you had earlier. In a flat, no carbon cost environment, this would be the relative cost per unit of energy to generate electricity today. Gas would be still the cheapest, and this is at about a $4 per million BTU gas price in the U.S. Coal slightly more expensive, nuclear a little bit more than that. If you impose the cost of carbon, and again, we have projected in the developed world the cost of carbon to grow to about 80. I think this is at 60, if I read the chart correctly. Yeah, $60 a ton of carbon. You'll see that the cost of generating electricity from coal as an energy source grows dramatically because it has a much higher carbon content and a greater carbon footprint. The cost of gas generation goes up a little less. It has a lower carbon footprint. Obviously, nuclear is unaffected by cost of carbon. It's not a carbon-generating fuel. It becomes more competitive in a world where policy would impose a cost of carbon. CCS means carbon cost and capture and storage. This is where you generate electricity with coal or gas, but then you collect the CO2 coming out of the top of that. Today, that is an expensive form. That doesn't mean technology won't improve that cost, but today that is an expensive form, and the residual carbon that comes out of there still says that in a cost of carbon world, that'll get a little more expensive. But today, that is more expensive than these other choices in terms of how to generate electricity. All right, so now we'll add renewables to that. If you look at the base cost of wind and or solar, they are not very competitive in a world where carbon costs are zero. They become more competitive in a world where we impose a cost of carbon. But there's a piece of the equation missing from this, and that's the intermittency issue associated with wind and solar power. For wind and solar power to supply an electrical grid, there needs to be a backup because the wind doesn't always blow and it's not always sunny. And so if you impose no additional costs on an electricity supply based on wind and solar, this is how they look. But as soon as you add to that the fact that if I rely on them, I then need to have a backup in terms of coal or gas or some other form of electrical generation, the relative cost of wind and solar goes up. Now, in a total grid and you know, using the Obama all of the above process, there is those backups as exist today, but the ability to accommodate wind and solar as a growing part of electrical generation is relying heavily on the infrastructure that we already have to generate electricity using gas or coal or other sources. So if we look at electricity demand, each of the sectors is growing significantly. And if you look at the fuel choices, you'll see that today, half of the world's electricity today, we think of coal as a fairly primitive source of energy, but half of the electricity in the world today is generated by coal. Over the next 30 years, we expect that percentage to decline as natural gas, because of carbon policy in some ways, and also just because of economics, gas and renewables will start to back coal out, and certainly the growth in electricity will be supplied primarily from natural gas and renewable sources of fuel. And if we focus just on renewables, and this is the percentage share of renewable fuels in generating electricity, the US and Europe and Asia Pacific, it becomes a fairly substantial percentage of the total electrical generation pool in that time frame, even primarily more so in Europe. The light green at the bottom there, that's hydro. Hydro will grow, but most of the main hydro sources have been relatively tapped already, so it doesn't grow as a percentage. It just grows in pace with the total demand growth. What you do see is more significant growth in wind. Solar will grow, but it is still more economically challenged even than wind in terms of supplying bulk electricity. But all of them will grow, and they very much do become a meaningful part of the creation of electricity by the year 2040. So when we look at the total, we add all that up, and so let's look at the total electricity or energy demand mix. Today, oil provides the greatest supply, and again, that 175 quadrillion BTUs, you can translate to about 90 million barrels a day of oil, which we use around the world today. Gas or coal is the second largest, with gas a third, and then you see a fairly small contribution in bulk from renewable sources. One more time. There we go. What we look by the year 2040 is oil use will grow, but more slowly. Gas will grow in aggregate amount the most, again, largely because of its more effective carbon footprint, as well as economics. Coal, we essentially will say it won't grow. There will be a little bit of growth early on, and then it'll trail off, again, because of the climate footprint imposed by coal. The other sources will grow faster, but it will take an awful lot of growth for them to meet a substantial amount of the total energy demand pool by the year 2040, which is why when I started, I said, we're going to show you a projection that says by the year 2040, with all of that technological innovation, with all the carbon policy overlays, et cetera, there is no way of supplying affordable energy to meet economic growth without oil and gas being a large part of the energy pool in that time frame. I thought this was an interesting picture. This takes that whole evolution of energy back to the year 1800. And it shows kind of almost by era. So you see back in the year 1800s, it was primarily biomass. You get to the year 1900 and you see the effect of coal use for the Industrial Revolution. And then you get to the middle of the last decade, or the last century, and you see the growth in oil as a transportation-based economy started taking shape. And then the increase in gas and nuclear, primarily driven by electrification of the economy. And so these trends, take place over long periods of time, and they will continue to evolve into the future, where we do expect, if you go further and further out in the future, that renewables become a greater source of the pie. Talk about CO2 emissions. What do we expect based on all this? With all of the energy growth, with all of the economic growth, we do see energy or CO2 emissions growing for the next 10 years or so, and then flattening out. They will shrink. They are already shrinking in North America and Europe. And there's two major reasons. One is substitution of coal with natural gas for electricity generation, and the other is energy efficiency. Vehicle efficiency and other forms of energy efficiency allows economies to grow in the developed world with a shrinking emissions platform. But not outside the developed world, where emerging economies need bulk sources of fuel. They'll take whatever they can afford to pay. That will create, so all of the growth in emissions is going to occur outside the developed world. But eventually we expect that will flatten out as even those countries begin to use more carbon-efficient fuels like natural gas and electricity. Emissions per capita, another way of expressing it, in the OECD world we expect per person emissions to shrink fairly significantly. In the non-OECD world, they will grow a little bit, and that's really driven by standard of living. All right, we're going to turn a little bit now. Where's all that energy going to come from? Today in the world, when we look at the oil side, that we expect today there's about 4.5 trillion barrels of oil yet to be produced. Today we consume about 30 to 35 billion barrels a year around the globe in terms of oil. And you'll see a reasonable distribution of the sources of that. The only difference is that in places like North America, most of that oil is in the form of unconventional forms of oil, heavy oil, tar sands, et cetera. If you go to the Middle East, it's mostly conventional oil. But there's a reasonable distribution. Latin America is also a big contributor, but that is primarily heavy oil in places like Venezuela. But about 4.5 trillion barrels. It's not a static view of the world, however, and I thought this next chart was real interesting. By the way, we produced to this point about 1.2 trillion barrels of oil. So from the time we started using oil for transportation up to today, we produced about 1.2 trillion. And at the current pace of consumption, there's roughly 100 years of oil demand left in the sources we know of today, that 4 trillion barrels. But when you look at our view of how much the endowment around the world is of oil, what this chart shows is that this is really about technology. That the growth in our view of what recoverable oil resources exist around the world has continued to grow dramatically as technologies have found, just like in the U.S., the combination of things like hydrofracking, horizontal drilling, et cetera, has made commercially viable production of oil resources that were not thought to be recoverable 10, 20, 30 years ago. So the endowment is not yet static. That doesn't mean that that chart will continue up forever, and at some point in time we may run out of that. But the endowment that we have to create recoverable oil in the future is not static. Today it's about 4.5 trillion. Will that be 4.5 trillion 10 or 20 years from now? That's going to depend a lot on continued technology advancement. What does that mean in terms of kind of where the oil is going to come from? What this really says is to meet the liquids demand and taking into account all of the conventional and unconventional sources that exist in the developed world, the reliance on Middle East energy will gradually grow over the next 30 years. Not dramatically, but it will gradually grow in order to supply that liquid demand. From a 30 million barrel a day range today up to maybe 40 million by the year 2040. So there's really no escaping the need for Middle Eastern production of oil in this time frame. The supply of energy today, there's a lower and lower contribution. It's still the bulk, but it decreases in terms of percentage of conventional energy production where you're just drilling a well into a conventional oil pool, and a greater contribution of things like oil sands, deep water production, oil shales, et cetera, biofuels included, in order to meet the liquid demand. And again, this just shows that by the year 2040, we project that we'll produce about 2 trillion barrels of the energy, of the liquid recoverable resources, which would still leave us something in the range of 4 trillion barrels to produce, unless we find more. Liquids trade. The liquids aren't always where you need them. The U.S. has been a net importer. As everybody reads, that level of import is shrinking to the point where we could conceive of North America being a net exporter of oil at some point in the future, but that's going to be more policy-driven, frankly, than technology-driven. Latin America is a small exporter for the world. Europe will always remain short of oil. They will need to continue to import. A lot of that will be provided as it is today from the Russian and Caspian area. The Middle East will continue to be the primary exporter of energy to the rest of the world, and obviously the biggest growth in that import requirement will continue to Asia Pacific, will suck in oil resources from the rest of the world. And again, that's kind of where we are today, and for the most part, we see those trends continuing. If we look at natural gas, similar story. We've got about 200 years worth of natural gas at current consumption levels available based on resources we're already aware of. The yellow shows unconventional resources. This is shale gas, tight gas, things that are, when you associate with, let's say, hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling. And the red is conventional. The resources are fairly well dispersed, but again, the Middle East has the highest concentration of conventional, which tends to be the lowest cost gas to produce. There is one big difference, though, and we'll get into this a little bit in the trade, between oil and gas, in that, for the most part, liquid fuels or oil, as long as you can get them out of the ground and get them to a port, you can get a ship to pick them up and take them pretty much anywhere. So it doesn't matter so much where you find liquids relative to where the demand is. Natural gas, not quite the same way. Its transportability is more expensive, and it does matter where you find it relative to where demand is. And we'll talk about LNG in a second. But you either have to pipe it to a demand center, so if you find it near population centers, that's great. But otherwise, you're left with a bit more of an economic challenge to make use of gas resources when they're found very remotely from where the demand is. Which is why we expect liquid natural gas transport to about triple over this time period. If you look at where the demand is, again, the demand is heavily in Asia Pacific. The supply is going to come more from the Atlantic Basin and Middle East, and we'll show again on trade flows that's going to drive exports into Asia Pacific to supply their growing need for natural gas for electricity purposes relative to their local endowment of gas resources. But LNG is the only way we have to reconnect sources of gas to the demand centers, and it's not a cheap way of moving it around. So natural gas trade will say the same thing today, and again, this is going to be somewhat policy driven. The gas endowment in the U.S. would absolutely support North America being an exporter to the rest of the world. Whether policies will allow that to happen is going to be a different question, and there's kind of been a very slow approval for LNG export terminals in the U.S. It's happening, but there's still some political resistance to that. Our view is, again, we're big supporters of free trade. Let resources be produced where they're most efficient to be produced and moved such that the total consumption of energy is as efficient as we can make it. Latin America is kind of not a really big player in natural gas from an import or export standpoint. Europe will continue to be an increasing importer of natural gas, with a lot of that being, again, supplied by the Russian and Caspian area. The Middle East and Africa will export, and Asia-Pac, based on its economic growth and its lack of in-country resources, will again be the largest importer and a growing importer of natural gas, primarily by LNG. All right, we talked a bit about earlier, and it's kind of, I'll take a bit of a turn. We believe the right answers for how to meet these challenges are driven by technology advancement, free trade, allowing market forces to function. And so the question is more, how do we in the U.S. participate and ensure that we retain a leadership in the technology advancement aspect of that? And we had a policy dialogue at work, and there's a few charts that I thought were very interesting and somewhat sobering in that regard. First off, when you look at international education rankings, and this is math and science, the U.S. is not really where we would want it to be. And by the way, I want to be very quick. This is not an indictment of institutions like Notre Dame. Notre Dame is very capable of effectively turning qualified high school seniors into scientists, mathematicians, and engineers. But you can only do it from the pool of high school students who are qualified to accept that type of education. And unfortunately, we are falling well behind many countries around the world in the ability to deliver an aggregate pool of educated math and science students. The other sobering aspect of that is the picture's not getting any brighter, frankly, because succeeding generations of our populations are falling further and further behind the international median in these studies. And this is a study called Program of International Student Assessment that creates this data. So we're not getting ahead. And the last chart says, and it's not because we're not spending enough. So we're spending more, but yet math and science literacy in the U.S. is falling further behind. And it's not because our students aren't advancing. It's because other countries are advancing much faster. And so if we want to participate, now what we do have going for us in the U.S. is an entrepreneurial culture, a more free trade culture, and those things have allowed us to maintain a technology leadership. But unless we can deliver generations of trained scientists, mathematicians, engineers into the future, holding on to that leadership is going to be very difficult. And from our Exxon Mobil perspective, we have three major community outreach initiatives around the world. One is malaria prevention. We have a lot of our activities in places like Africa where that is a serious health issue. And so we spend a lot of time helping malaria prevention. The empowerment of women around the world and participation of women in economic development on a global basis. And the last is math and science education. So in the U.S., we're participants in the National Math and Science Initiative. We have fostered with Phil Mickelson, the golfer, the Mickelson Teacher Academies in order to, it's not just about getting skills to the students, it's about exciting students at an early age in math and science so they have the interest in acquiring math and science skills that could be applied to technology in the future. And there's several initiatives. So this is where we spend our energy. But as I said, it is sobering. If you look at all the technology we need, what is the U.S.'s ability to participate in it? So that's what I had. Now, very happy to take any questions anybody has on any of this. Way up in the back.
Can you speak a little bit to where you see the infrastructure in places like North Dakota, maybe in the coming years, where they're literally burning off natural gas Can you repeat that?
Yeah, the question was, what do I see about growth in infrastructure? There's a tremendous amount of energy production growth in places like North Dakota, but today the infrastructure isn't there to collect all the gas. When you produce oil, there's usually gas that comes with it, what they call associated gas. And today there's not an infrastructure to get that gas that's being produced to demand centers, and so a lot of it is being flared today. I don't think it's going to be allowed to continue. Frankly, it's not economic and continue today, but the infrastructure has to be built. But it's neither an efficient use of fuel nor is it environmental friendly to be doing that. So it's got to be gradually reined in, and that flaring has got to be pulled back. As I said, it's kind of wasting an endowment. I think it is a near-term necessity because the infrastructure doesn't exist. But that infrastructure is going to get gradually built. Yeah?
Mr. Schleckser, I'm a guy who creates a technology like fracking where that's efficient. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Right.
Yeah.
So if I'm a guy who creates a technology like fracking that makes conventional oil use much more efficient, there's a huge incentive space for companies like Exxon Mobil to buy my technology. What's the incentive space like for people who create game-changing inventions in things like electric cars or hybrid uses? I mean, it's not unrealistic, I don't think, to think by 2040 there could be a massive change in those types of technologies simply because somebody invents something new. But could you speak to that at all?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways that new technology enters the spectrum. We have fundamental research. The challenge with electrical cars today, it's range and it's battery cost. Someday, there may well be a technology breakthrough that solves that. And if that happens, you're going to see a much greater penetration. But today, the cost of an electrical vehicle is so much greater. The payback period in terms of fuel savings to own an electrical vehicle today is just, people will buy them, but it's a very small fraction. It's like 0.1%, but it's just not economic. It costs way too much. You don't save enough fuel. It will take some evolution or revolution in battery technology to change that equation. People don't want to plug in every 60 miles. They want more range, and they want better economics. But the development of that, the development of a lot of technology, the development of the whole hydrofracking and horizontal drilling, I wouldn't say it was happenstance, but we've been fracking wells in the U.S. for 50 or 60 years. What really somebody put together is we learned how to drill horizontally, and they said, well, there were resources that before, if we just drilled a well straight down into them, there was not enough permeability, there was not enough flow of energy to those wells to make them commercially viable for the cost of the well. But if we drill them down and then we drill horizontally such that the reach of that well covers a lot more turf, and then in stages we frack around them, which essentially means injecting sand and water and some chemicals into the surrounding rock to crack the rock and allow greater permeability. All of a sudden, that resource becomes economic. But it's not because we learned how to frack, it's that we've been doing that. Somebody put together, if I combine fracking with this new horizontal drilling technology, it totally changes the commercial dynamics of that well. And that was really done by Mitchell Energy. It was a fairly small energy company and in the science arena there. So there's lots of different arenas. In terms of energy technology, we are one of the founding sponsors of the Stanford Global Climate and Energy Project, which is really around trying to foster breakthrough technologies around energy, providing energy to allow economies to grow, and managing economic or environmental footprint associated with doing that. I guess my answer, I don't think there's any one way. I think companies are always looking for technological advancement. We're an energy company, but our primary expertise is in oil and gas. And if you look at oil and gas's position within the energy mix, we do have a view that us learning how to do what we do progressively better, being more efficient about what we do, will have a very big bearing on managing carbon footprint, managing energy efficiency, rather than us trying to be something we're not today. That doesn't mean those other things, wind, solar, et cetera, aren't very important, and technology breakthroughs and those things are very important. But that's just not our core skill set. So, as I said, I think technology finds its way, ideas, innovation, entrepreneurship finds its way, all sorts of different avenues. Yeah.
Is this on? Thank you, by the way, for the presentation. It was very informative. I learned a lot. My question to you is, what do you think is the likelihood of storage capabilities for solar or wind, and then how would that affect Exxon's operations should significant changes occur in the technological landscape?
I'm sorry, I don't, solar and...
Well, like with solar, you said it wouldn't be significant, and, I think a big part of that is you can't store the energy,
Well, solar has two. One is just expensive.
Right.
So, solar panel technology breakthrough. I mean, if there is a revolution in that cost, which brings that cost per unit of power way down, solar will take off. The other challenge of solar is that you've got to add to its cost the cost of having a backup system of power generation for the days where the sun's not shining. So wind and solar both have that same issue of intermittency, where you need some other means of filling the grid on the days that the wind isn't blowing so hard or the sun isn't shining. So that is part of the cost equation of relying heavily on solar as your primary source of energy for an electricity grid.
Right, and so on days when it's not sunny or not windy, if there was a technology to store the power...
Absolutely.
Right.
I think that's part of the same equation. And there are some storage capacities in grids, but again, if you think about, unfortunately, electricity transmission is just fraught with losses. And that's another area of, can you minimize transmission losses? Remember the chart I showed today, that it takes twice as much energy into the front end of an electricity generation system to deliver the final output of electricity where the demand is. And that's the loss in generation and the loss in transmission. That on its own, solving transmission losses, would be huge. Yeah.
Hi, I just had a question. You mentioned that you were targeting, I guess, younger U.S. kids to get more excited about math and science. Can you speak to some of those programs or initiatives a little bit more?
There is a National Science and Math Initiative that we participate in. And a lot of that is around teacher qualification. And then the Mickelson Teachers Academy, which is, again, an effort to better equip teachers at the primary and secondary levels to, one, excite, and then, two, prepare kids to think about a future in a science or math-related field. There's a number of other programs, but those are the two major programs we participate in. And we're founding members of both, actually. I mean, if you think about it, the U.S. education, it's less of an issue for Exxon Mobil. We participate in economies all over the world. We hire people from all over the world. So those people in the ranks above the United States, they're available to Exxon Mobil to hire and satisfy our needs for engineers, scientists, et cetera. It's a U.S. issue. Now, we'd like to hire those people in the U.S. We're a U.S.-based company. But we can scratch that itch in other ways. Our concern is, why aren't we? As if you think of the place the U.S. stands from an economic standpoint, et cetera, why shouldn't we be at the lead? And as I said, and what we have in favor of us is a very entrepreneurial culture which allows smart people, to your question, to get their ideas into new technologies, et cetera. So we have the culture, but we're not delivering the size pool of talented or trained people that we need. Yeah.
If I may, please, could you share with this audience what you feel to be the good and the bad of spending 35 years with the same employer?
Spending 35 years with the same employer. Well, first off, I have to say, my dad spent 36 years with the same employer before I started, so we've been an ExxonMobil family. And it's interesting because we hire, very clearly, when we hire today, it was not just me getting hired 35 years ago. When I come here and recruit MBAs or we come here and recruit engineers today, we are trying to play up the view that we can offer an enriching 30 to 40-year career. And our goal, we're a large and complex enough company that, frankly, if people don't spend that much time with us, it's hard to understand the company well enough to manage it at a senior level. So you will never see in the press ExxonMobil fills senior vice president by pulling somebody from another company. We believe that we're much better off developing our own managerial talent for people who have invested themselves with the company. So from my standpoint, I find it more enriching. You get invested. You get to live with the results of your effort. And as I said, what we're looking for when we hire folks is someone who has the view of making a long-term career path with us. Now, what we have to offer to make that compelling is a breadth of experiences, good compensation, but frankly, you can find compensation in lots of places. But it's got to be exciting. You'll like the people you work with. And I'll make one pitch for the connection between Notre Dame and ExxonMobil. It's got to be a company where its values are aligned with your values. So how we go about doing business, the business integrity, ethics, all of those things, you're going to find a level of stress if you're working for a company whose approach to those things doesn't match your sense of those same values. That's going to wear you down over time. And so I have never found in 35 years with ExxonMobil that they've ever asked me to do anything that was at all in conflict with the same values that I think the people here are taught to bring forward. So to me, you have to be culturally aligned, you have to have interesting work, a breadth of work so you always feel fresh, and you got to like the people you work with. But I never set out, and it's not that I remember saying I'm never going anywhere else, but I've never had a reason to leave, and every job I've had has really taught me something I've enjoyed. So that's still our approach. It's very difficult, frankly, when we talk to students, because a lot of students, especially in the MBA type programs, get a sense of kind of plotting their own future. If the grass looks green over there, go over there. And so we have to convince them that there's a reason to stick it out with a company like us. And I think we do offer a broad enough set of opportunities. You read my resume. I've had 21 jobs in all sorts of different areas, and it taught me to learn how to manage without being an expert. It taught me a lot of things, and they're all fresh experiences, so I never felt stale. Anyone else? I know right away between you guys and lunch, so.
Oh, you have a question? Yeah. Oh, right there. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk today. We talked a little bit about non-traditional energy sources, and I'm given to understand that ExxonMobil is invested in some way in renewables, though that's clearly not the bulk of the cash stream. Can you talk a little bit about some of those renewables? I understand you have some experimentation in algae and a few other commodities.
I sure can. We used to be invested in a number of different, we had a solar company, we had a nuclear company back in the 70s and 80s, and frankly at the time they weren't commercially viable, and we got out of them at that point in time. So when we looked at where do we want to participate in alternative fuel sources, as I said, one, we're a founding member of the Stanford Climate and Energy Project, which is looking for breakthrough energy technologies, keeping carbon and environmental footprint in mind. One of the things we did embark on a number of years ago was investigating the use of oil-producing algae as a source of energy. And you said, well, why did we pick that? And our goal was to pick a renewables opportunity which we thought ultimately had the ability to, one, be carbon effective in the cycling of algae, since algae consumes carbon dioxide to grow as it produces oil. So it is positive from a carbon footprint standpoint. And frankly, if you look at things like corn-based ethanol, it's very questionable whether that is a positive from a carbon and an environmental footprint standpoint. But also one that had the opportunity to become commercially viable without government subsidy. So those are the criteria that we've applied to where we wanted to invest ourselves. And what we saw, and frankly, we're years and years away from that algae research bearing fruit. It still has those same characteristics. But in order to get algae streams which are viable, produce at a density that's great enough, and in terms of not just the carbon footprint, but the land footprint associated with them, we're a long way away. But again, why are we focused there and not in some of the others? It's, to our view today, the others still are too heavily reliant on government subsidies to be viable. And we think eventually that creates an inefficient economic solution. So we'd rather be invested where we think, if it's successful, and I would say that I would still put it as probably a long shot, that algae will be ultimately successful as a bulk producer of energy. But if it is, it's very carbon efficient because of the absorption of CO2 to grow the algae, and then the cycling of that with the energy it produces. And it has the opportunity, or at least we could see the potential for it to be commercially viable.
Texas is a big place.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. But and look, we made some breakthroughs, but we're a long way away. We've partnered with synthetic genomics in order to do that work, and they're the experts in the field. But there's a lot of genetic work to do to get to that point.
Other questions?
I think lunch is winning over.
Good. Bob Schleckser, thank you so much.
You bet.